Okay, so the left claims they have come to an agreement on this so-called respect for marriage bill. In the sense, when they say come to an agreement, they mean they claim they've addressed the issues regarding religious liberty. But this is false, and I will tell you why. Senator Mike Lee proposed an amendment that clearly and explicitly protects religious institutions from retaliation if the institution holds the biblical view that marriage is between one man and one woman, it is ordained by God, and that government has no authority to redefine that term or violate the religious practice of that institution or organization. All it would have taken is the Senate to adopt that amendment, but they didn't. They rejected this amendment, which tells us, well, are they really committed to protecting religious liberty, or are they just paying lip service to it in their PR, while the language of the bill itself would not protect religious liberty? Option number 2 that I just presented is obviously the correct one. They rejected Senator Lee's amendment in favor of Susan Collins, senator from Maine, her amendment, which is not explicit and does not provide any additional amendments. In fact, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Dr. Kevin Roberts, issued the following statement, and I think it's worth reading. He says, conservatives are deeply disappointed by the betrayal of Senate Republicans to protect Americans' religious freedom and won't soon forget the votes of the 12 Republican senators who cast aside an essential right in a bill that will weaponize the federal government against believers of nearly every major religion. There is still an opportunity for senators to correct their mistake before voting for final passage. Senator Mike Lee has offered an amendment that provides religious liberty protections and addresses the bill's most glaring problems. Conversely, the amendment proposed by Senator Susan Collins offers no legal protections for the tax-exempt status of religious nonprofits, schools, and colleges who will be persecuted by the 87,000 new IRS agents President Biden wants to hire. All of us who believe in marriage must commit to defending this sacred institution as the bedrock of a flourishing civil society. It will be a litmus test for any aspirant for the White House in 2024. I love that. That is what you call a culture warrior. Dr. Roberts at the Heritage Foundation is one of the only people, one of the most prominent people, but one of the only people to actually say it how it is, to address the reality of this situation. Ryan T. Anderson, Dr. Anderson was another one. He said, had the Senate sponsors wanted to, they could have explicitly stated that no individual or organization could be penalized by the government for operating according to the conviction that marriage unites husband and wife, particularly that the IRS may not strip any such organization of its nonprofit status. But the bill offers no such protections. It's not a compromise, not even a bad compromise. It enshrines a false definition of marriage in our law and then tells people that they can have their day in court if and when they get sued. That's not public policy for the common good. This should be every single Republican in the Senate. This should be every single Republican in the House. This should be every single Republican or right-wing or conservative pundit. And yet, very few people are speaking up about this. There, by the way, are even questions about, so what this bill specifically does is it forces the federal government to recognize any so-called marriage that was done according to a state law. So if you live in a state where gay marriage is not legal and you've gotten married or quote unquote married in a state that does recognize or that does validate same-sex marriages, then the federal government is required to recognize your union, even if you live in a state where it is against state law. So the logical conclusion of that premise is a valid question about whether the federal government could be forced to recognize polygamous marriages or marriages between an adult and a child. Because if all it takes is one state defining marriage in any way that state wants to, and the federal government is required to recognize that, I don't know what the limiting principle on that is. The limiting principle on that is nothing. The most radical leftist state in our country will be redefining the word marriage, and we will all be forced to validate that.